It doesn't start with shouting or rudeness or anything anyone could point a finger at. It begins in the silence, in a conversation that used to feel easy but now ends too early, in a feeling that maybe people are pulling back and you're not sure why. No one tells us this part, that as we grow older, our habits change, not because we're mean, not because we've stopped caring, but because we've carried so much for so long, we don't always notice what hardened along the way. And without meaning to, we start to build small walls where we once built bridges. But softness can return, so can listening, so can warmth. 1. Dwelling on the negative. It never sounds harsh, just a sigh, a quiet "these days," a passing mention of what's broken, what hurts, what doesn't work anymore. We tell ourselves it's honesty, that we're naming things as they are, but slowly, without meaning to, our voice begins to carry weight. Not the kind people admire, the kind they brace against. They still love us, still care, but they start preparing for the heaviness before the phone even rings. The room changes when we enter, not because we did anything wrong, but because we've forgotten how to let light in first. We've lived long, we've seen things, and yes, the world has changed. Sometimes not for the better, but when every story we tell has the same ending, hope starts to leave the room before the conversation finishes. Negativity doesn't always shout, it lingers. It coats the air like steam from a pot left boiling too long. You don't notice it at first, but soon you can't breathe as easily, and no one tells you, because no one wants to hurt you. So they visit less, call less, or keep the conversation short and cheerful just to avoid the slow descent. This isn't about pretending, it's not about becoming positive. It's about making space for something else to breathe beside the truth. A memory that brings color, a pause that invites another voice, a silence that doesn't sag under the weight of everything going wrong. Because wisdom doesn't need fog to be felt. Sometimes the lightest thing we can offer is our willingness to leave one complaint unsaid, so someone else can find their way in. 2. Interrupting to prove we belong. We don't mean to talk over them. We just want to show them we understand, that we've been there, that we're still here. So we jump in before the sentence is finished, before the silence fully forms, before they get to say it their way. We call it connection, but sometimes it feels like disappearance, because what they hear is that their story wasn't needed, that we already lived it and closed the book. We're not trying to silence, we're trying to belong. We want to prove that our life still fits in the room, that our voice still knows where the thread is going, that we matter not because we're loud, but because we've lived enough to recognize the pattern early. But the truth is, people don't always want recognition. They want room to stumble, to explore, to feel their way through a thought without having it translated mid-sentence. And when we speak too soon, even with the best intentions, they stop bringing things to us that aren't fully formed. Because it's not just about being heard, it's about being given time to find the words on their own. So maybe this is the new wisdom, not showing we've seen it all, but proving we can still wait for what someone else is learning to say. Because sometimes the most generous thing we can offer is the pause where their voice gets to be the only one. 3. Truth without timing. We've earned the right to speak plainly, and sometimes we do. We say what we see, what we've learned, what we no longer have time to sugarcoat, and we call it honesty, because it is. But honesty without invitation often feels like interruption, not because it's untrue, but because it wasn't time. We don't mean to hurt, we don't mean to silence. But sometimes truth without softness lands like a stone on soil that isn't ready. They flinch, not because they disagree, but because they weren't prepared to open. And slowly, without meaning to, they stop asking. Not because we're wrong, but because our truth arrives before their readiness does. We think truth is the gift, but often timing is the grace. It's not about walking on eggshells, it's about walking beside. letting our voice meet theirs with warmth, with breath, with patience. Because wisdom that speaks too quickly becomes noise, but wisdom that waits becomes shelter. What if truth isn't just what we say, but how we choose to say it? Not to correct, but to protect what matters more, the connection that allows the truth to land safely. Because in the end, they won't remember our precision. They'll remember if they still felt held after the truth came in. 4. Judgment that feels like safety. It doesn't sound cruel, it sounds firm, certain, like wisdom wrapped in warning. We say it because we've lived, because we've seen what happens when things go off track, because we want to protect what we know matters. And that's the trouble. Judgment often comes dressed as care, but to them it doesn't feel like protection. It feels like rejection. We don't mean to push, we mean to guide. But slowly, our certainty becomes a wall, not to defend them, but to defend what we were raised to believe. And in holding that line so tightly, we start to lose sight of the people on the other side. They don't push back, they just stop sharing. They bring less of themselves to our table because they know what parts will be questioned before they're heard. We're not wrong, but we may not be ready to make space for a world that changed without asking us first. And here's the truth. Judgment rarely invites someone closer. It asks them to choose between their truth and our approval. And most often, they choose distance. So what if we set down the shield? What if we asked instead of concluded? What if we made room for the parts of them that haven't made sense to us yet? Not to change our values, but to open the door a little wider than it's been. Because connection isn't built by guarding what we know, it's built by being curious about what we don't. 5. Refusing help to keep control. We say, I've got it, I'm okay, I can manage. Even when our hands ache, even when the jar won't open, even when the chair feels a little too low to rise from without effort, because asking feels like slipping. Like admitting the ground has shifted beneath us. We built our lives on self-reliance, on carrying others, on being the one people leaned on. And now to accept help feels like rewriting everything we stood for. But maybe it's not about surrender, maybe it's about trust. Because when we say, I'm fine, what we might really mean is, I'm afraid that if I ask once, I'll be forgotten altogether. But here's the quiet truth. Letting someone help is a form of giving. It's not about being needy. It's about letting them love us in the language they know best. Action, the lift of a bag, the offering of an arm, the way they stay in the doorway just a little longer because they still want to be useful. We don't lose dignity when we allow others in. We gain a kind of sacred closeness that only exists when we stop holding everything alone. There is strength in standing tall, but there is tenderness in letting someone steady you as you rise. Not because you can't, but because you don't have to. 6. Talking more than listening. We speak because we want to stay present, to remind them that we're still here, still sharp, still full of something to give. So we fill the spaces, we offer stories, we share memories that meant something to us, hoping they'll mean something to them too. But slowly, without meaning to, our words become the air no one else knows how to breathe in. They nod, they smile, they wait for the next pause that doesn't arrive. And not because they're bored, but because there's no room. We forget to ask, forget to wait, forget that silence is not always absence. Sometimes it's permission. Permission for them to enter, to respond, to shape the space between us instead of watching us fill it alone. We're not dominating, we're trying to matter, to prove that our voice still belongs in the room. But there's another kind of belonging that grows only in quiet. It's in the moment we ask a question and mean it. In the pause that says, you don't have to rush, I'm here. Listening isn't about being quiet. It's about holding the door open long enough for someone else to step through. And maybe that's what they need from us now. Not another story, but the space to tell their own. 7. critiquing the young. Their world moves faster, their music pulses through closed doors, their words stretch and bend in ways we don't always follow. They speak with a confidence we sometimes mistake for carelessness. And when we don't understand, we critique. Not because we don't care, but because we want them to slow down long enough to notice what we've learned. But here's what softens that edge. We were once confusing, too. We once wore things that made no sense to our parents, listened to voices they didn't trust, said things we couldn't yet back up with experience. And somehow, someone let us figure it out. They let us grow awkwardly without crushing us under correction. We owe them our patience now. Critique feels like control, but curiosity feels like care. Asking instead of assuming, listening instead of labeling, sitting beside instead of standing over. They may not always get it right, but neither did we. And when we forget that, we become the very silence we once pushed against. So maybe wisdom now isn't proving we know better. It's remembering what it felt like to be trying and still loved anyway. Curiosity builds the bridge that critique can't reach. 8. Finishing sentences that weren't ours. We think we're helping. We've heard this before. We know where it's going. So we reach in to offer the word, to complete the thought, to smooth the stumble before it fully forms. And maybe we're right. Maybe we do know, but that's not the point. Because to the person speaking, what they feel is interruption. Even wrapped in kindness, it still lands as a hand placed gently over their mouth. They needed space to find the word, to linger in the uncertainty, to feel that their pace wasn't something that needed saving. But we move quickly, not to take control, but because silence makes us nervous, because we think support means speed. What if it didn't? What if support meant waiting through the pause, trusting the breath that hasn't landed yet? Some people find their thoughts like stairs, one at a time, carefully. And when we rush ahead, we carry them to the top without letting their feet ever touch the steps. It's not that we silence them, it's that they stop believing their own voice is strong enough to finish the sentence. So now we practice the pause. We let the silence stretch a little longer than we're used to. We keep the sentences unfinished. Not because we don't know, but because we remember what it feels like to not be rushed. Because listening isn't just about hearing the right words, it's about offering enough space for them to rise on their own. 9. Believing we already know. This one doesn't shout, it doesn't interrupt, it doesn't argue, it just nods too quickly, smiles a little too tight, and says, "I've heard this before." We don't mean to close the door, we just think we've seen the view, we've read the book, lived the chapter, outlived the lesson. But when we do that, even quietly, something in the other person pauses. They hold back, they shift, they realize we're no longer listening to learn, we're listening to confirm what we already believe. And that's when the room gets smaller. Because wisdom isn't just what we know, it's how long we're willing to stay open to what we don't. To the version of the story we've never heard, to the language someone younger is still forming, to the truth that might not change us, but might let them grow. Being the elder doesn't mean we've stopped learning. It means we've learned how to stay curious even when the topic is familiar, even when we've walked the same road 100 times, and still pause to notice what's different underfoot. The people who keep coming to us aren't looking for answers. They're looking for space where they don't have to be right yet. So maybe the kindest thing we can say isn't, "I already know." It's, "Tell me anyway." Because wisdom that listens outlasts wisdom that insists. And the kind of elder people return to isn't the one who knows everything. It's the one who still has room for something new. They won't remember whether we were correct. They'll remember if they felt safe while learning beside us. Not small, not scolded, not rushed toward a version of themselves we thought they should already be. They don't need our certainty, they need our presence. Someone who lets the moment unfold without tightening it too quickly. Someone who stays in the room when things are awkward without fixing the air. Because being wise was never about being loud. It was about being still, enough to hold space for someone else to become. Softness doesn't mean we've lost our edge. It means we've learned that transformation happens in warm rooms. And maybe that's what they're really looking for now. Not the answer, not the lecture, not even the story. Just the elder who can sit across from them without needing to be right and simply say, "I'm here, I'm listening, take your time." Maybe it was a habit you picked up quietly when no one was looking, a way of speaking, a way of holding on, a way of proving you still mattered in the room. If something came to mind, you don't have to explain it. You don't have to undo it all today. You can just leave a word, a whisper, a small signal that says, "I noticed." And maybe that noticing isn't the end of anything. It's the beginning of softness, of returning without apology to the part of you that never wanted distance in the first place. We'll be here, in the quiet space between your release and your next breath.